Hello and welcome back to the Fletchers Solicitors podcast. For every birth, for every baby, for every family, championing better maternity care through every family's story. This podcast series is produced and brought to you by Fletchers Solicitors, a leading national personal injury and medical negligence law firm with a distinct speciality in catastrophic birth injury claims. When things go wrong in maternity care, families need answers, and every case carries a wider responsibility to learn, to improve, and to help prevent harm. This podcast series aims to raise awareness of the current challenges in maternity and neonatal care in the UK, to support families at some of the most difficult and life-changing moments in their lives, and to collaborate with clinicians, organisations, and charities to support learning. And we hope by being involved in conversations like the one we will be having today, it improves safety, learnings and outcome across maternity care for every mother and every baby. This episode will focus on midwives and the law, the rules, the reality and the impact. Welcome back to our second episode of our podcast, For Every Birth, For Every Baby, For Every Family. Our aim is to build conversations and work together to improve and champion better maternity care. This episode is about midwives and the law, where we will be discussing the legal framework, professional pressures and the realities of practice. Joining us today are Amanda Clifton and Kathryn Rothwell, experienced midwives and expert witness for Bush & Co. Collectively, they bring together a wealth of experience in clinical leadership and expert evidence. We are also joined by Kashmir Uppal, a specialist solicitor. Kashmir is part of the Law Society's specialist clinical panel since 2004 and brings with her over 30 years' worth of experience. Thank you very much for being here today. We're really grateful for you being part of this conversation. I know your insight will be extremely valuable to the conversations we're having. So thank you very much for being here. Can I start with you, Kathryn? So we're talking about all things midwives. What is the role of a midwife?
The role of the midwife is a massive role. So midwives are there from the beginning of pregnancy, some of their prior to pregnancy, all the way to potentially 6 weeks after the birth. The midwife, their role is kind of encompasses so many different aspects of the family life. So it can be the clinical aspects. So it can be the ensuring that the pregnancy is going smoothly, the postnatal period smoothly, and also the birth goes well. So from the midwife's role, they also are part of health promotion and making sure that the advice that's given to families is that's supporting them to kind of grow and develop and ensuring that that family will have the best outcome possible. The midwife is in the clinical role, making sure that every time they see someone, they're doing risk assessments and just ensuring that they're an advocate and supporting and having that availability to families.
And from your experience on the ground floor, do midwives understand their role when they start their shift and the responsibilities?
The midwives can work in different areas. So I think a community midwife will have worked in that area, and their role is very different from a midwife that's working on the labour ward or a specialist midwife. If you are within that kind of core role, you know exactly what you're coming on to into that shift or onto that day. Obviously, maternity changes. Labour ward in particular has fluctuations in what's happening. So midwives should know that the key point of what they're doing on their day is to ensure the safety of the mother and the baby, and to be the advocate, be someone who listens, and to know the parameters of their role. So when it becomes outside of their remit and when it needs to become the obstetricians involved or, other specialists that need to get involved. So it's about that referral process and also that awareness of when someone else is needed. So coming on to shift on a labour ward, if you're on the shift on the labour ward, you know that you're more than likely going to be looking after a family in that process of having their baby or have recently had their baby. So you understand what you need to do to ensure that immediate period is going to plan and escalating if it's not. I think when you think about midwives and you think about, like, you can have a vast array of years experience. So your early career midwives, what they come on to, what their expectations are, might be different to a midwife who's got 30 years of labour ward care under a belt. And I think that is part of the experience of that day of what they're likely to come on to. You may not expect an early career midwife to look after a very complex case. So everyone's day might look similar and you might have a bit of an expectation of what you're coming to, but there is that slight deviation on how it will go, dependent on your experience as well.
Definitely. And from your own experience, I know I've introduced you briefly, but can you just tell me, in terms of your experience and your background, what does that look like in terms of your qualifications, but also, where your experiences lie?
I've been a midwife for coming up to 20 years now. I have worked both in the community. I've worked as a continuity midwife, so in like a case loading manner, and worked in areas that were high and low risk, of areas that had high deprivation levels as well. And then I have come in from community and have worked predominantly over the last 13 years on labour ward. I've worked both in kind of the high risk aspect of labour ward and on the more midwifery-led labour ward and in the assessment areas. For the last 10 years, I've been a labour ward coordinator. So the role of the labour ward coordinator has definitely been a developing role over the last few years, and has been progressing and changing. But the key points of me as a labour ward coordinator is to ensure the kind of oversight of how the labour ward is running, ensuring that the staff have got someone to come to. So as a labour ward coordinator, you should be supernumerary and working there to help everyone that's on that shift. Alongside that role, I also am a lecturer in midwifery, which has crept up on me. It's been about 4 years that I've been doing that now. So I see the development of the brand new students and their progress, and then quite a lot of the students that I'm involved in teaching with actually come and work in the unit that I'm based in. So it's nice to see that kind of progress of the early careers and continuing on.
You mentioned just briefly there about, midwives in the community and in the labour wards. I am guessing, and it's probably where I bring Amanda into it, because I know you come from a more of a governance role. So you may or may not have a different view to this, but is it fair to say that midwives in the community and midwives, for example, in the labour ward, or even your role as a labour ward coordinator, the roles, although similar, are different in terms of, I'm guessing, the level of intensity and the pressure that comes with that?
It's probably quite variable. We know that labour ward can be more acute in things that happen, but that can also occur in the community setting. And I would probably say, don't know if Amanda agrees, that we are having more high risk women and families wanting to have their birth experience within the community setting. So I think the complexities for community midwives is actually increasing as well, especially with the light on home births that's occurred in the media recently as well.
That very tragic case, wasn't there?
Yeah. So I think there is the positive within the hospital is you pull an emergency buzzer and you're much more likely to get a good group of people around you in the hospital. In the community, that isn't the capacity that you have. You've got to call your ambulance, and it depends on where that midwife works in community, there are some areas where it can be a very long time before they can get help, dependent on the geographical area, in regards to, your ambulance times and things like that. So yes, the community role on a day-to-day basis, running of clinics, is probably more routine-based than in the hospital, but there's definitely some complexities that can occur and emergencies that can occur in that situation.
No, absolutely, I agree. I mean, it has been a changing and evolving job. I've been in midwifery I've been in nursing and midwifery for over 30 years now, and it's definitely evolved. I was very much a community midwife. I was part of the continuity, the first experiment they did when it was maternity focus, so to actually see if continuity worked as a scheme. So there was our service and the Albany practice were part of that, and there were books written about it, etc. So that's where it originally came from. So I've really seen, what we can achieve in community. But as you say, I mean, I went on. I'm currently retired a year ago from the NHS, and I'm doing expert witness work and project work, governance work, and also some clinical work to keep my hand in. Excuse the pun. But it's, it is an evolving workforce, and it is incredibly difficult. And I don't think you can actually say that any one area is more or less stressful than the other. In terms of community, when I first started, the appointment was 15 minutes for an antenatal check, and you had quite a few things to do. But you probably knew this woman. You probably knew them from, their 3 pregnancies before, because you were based at that surgery and you never moved. Whereas now, this is probably the first time you're meeting them. You've got a list of about 30 things you need to cover in terms of information giving to that family and things to tick off on a computer, etc. So the actual interaction between the woman and the midwife has changed fundamentally. And then when you look at cases, when you look at some of the work that we're doing, it's those, dropping the ball at those, really fraught appointments.
Do you get more time though? Is that accommodated
No,
for? Is it still the 15
same
minutes?
Amount of time. So, you have an hour booking for when you first come through, but the other appointments are the same amount of time. But, everyone tells us, right, we need to add this health information at this point. We need to add this. You need to give them this. Chances are, you've got probably 30 or 40 other languages that you didn't have 10, 15 years ago. So there's all that complexity that these community midwives are dealing with. I will guarantee you their clinic will be running over. They won't have a lunch break because they'll work through it to try and get back to, if people don't turn up, they've got to make sure that they follow that up. There'll be a really rigid, if someone doesn't attend 1 or 2 times, they need to flag it, and if they forget, that then becomes one of those cases that we're then dealing with as expert witnesses. So the minutiae of the ball that can be dropped is still massive. Yeah. But then you've also got the labour ward where you could have all that case that might have had things that haven't been picked up. That midwife's got to find that information in the notes while looking after a distressed family. And then you've got a labour ward coordinator who, as Kathryn quite rightly said, is having to think about the skill mix of all her staff. And is this the right case to put them in on? And should this person be over here? And the postnatal ward is phoning to say they need to bring 3 people up. And which one does she bring first? And the doctors aren't here, but you've got 2 rooms. Tell me I'm wrong. This is...
there's a lot of conversations from people.
An average day on the labour ward. So there, there is that nail-biting stress there as well, and asking for advice, etc.
It's really, really great to hear you talk about that level of insight that you provided about the intensity behind the midwives' roles, both in the community and in the labour ward. Because often I think it's easy to forget the amount of pressure that midwives, as well as all of the clinicians, are under through no fault of their own, and it's a systemic issue more than anything. So that's really, really helpful. Amanda, you've already told me a little bit about yourself. I want to delve into that if I can, and just ask you to share a bit more about your experience, but also if you can just talk me through the role of a midwife in governance, because I know this is a role that you currently undertake, and having had conversations with you in the past, I know how passionate you are about it.
Yeah, okay. So as I said, I'm dual qualified. I'm a nurse and a midwife. I did my nurse training in the army, so I'm trained as a combat med tech, which is like a paramedic in battle situations. I was in the first Gulf War, which was a fascinating experience. I then went off and did my midwifery training at King's, and I worked in quite a few of the London trusts after that. Again, I've done caseload care. I worked in the community for a long time. I really enjoyed community work. Then went into the labour ward after that. I've gone through all the matron roles. I've been a consultant midwife, and my last role in the NHS was as a head of midwifery and gynecology nursing. So running a service over 2 sites, and had 500 odd staff to look after, etc. So was really kind of responsible. My name was on the CQC register in terms of if things go wrong, etc. So in terms of the making sure that the governance process for the whole trust in maternity was really kept up to date. And obviously, we've gone through a really interesting time recently. There's been lots of reports and lots of scrutiny around maternity. So the amount of, assurances that we're having to provide has probably quadrupled, I would say. So what we see is it used to be that there was, community midwives, antenatal clinic midwives, labour ward midwives. There's now specialist midwives in governance, in diabetes, in, you name it, there are midwives being taken into additional roles because the average midwife on the ground floor, and I'd say average advisedly, they don't have the time to do that. So we've had to create these additional roles to support them in doing all the things. And one of those is governance. And that's really around, making sure that we are learning from anything that we do, if there are mistakes made or if something happens, well, why? What happened? Getting to the real root cause of it and trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, it's really important that even the average midwife on the ground understands what governance is, understands what those midwives are doing for them to support them, and takes a real keen interest in reading, because we produce these reports that say this is what happened, but if the midwives who are working the next day don't read that, then it's no good. You're not going to learn. So it's about also, being an empowering individual that makes people want to understand their service and understand, how they can make themselves better at work.
Absolutely, and it's so important to be able to have those honest conversations where you are able to actually pass on that knowledge and guidance to everybody around you, because ultimately what we all want is to improve maternity care. And I always say midwives don't come into this profession wanting to provide unsafe care. They don't. So that's really, really important. You talked about the investigations and learnings, and we will go on to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But can I ask you, when a trust does investigate, when something does go wrong, what is the role of a midwife in that scenario?
In terms of if they were involved on the ground floor?
Yes, and both involved and investigating somebody who
Okay.
has been involved.
I mean, there's various facets, so it's probably important as well to just mention in terms of what we used to have, which was supervision of midwifery, which has now evolved, hasn't it? So midwives do have that support from their professional midwifery advocate. Professional midwifery advocates are usually senior midwives, but it can be a quite junior midwife, but it's who other midwives would entrust to help and support them in learning and becoming better versions of themselves, if you like. So there is that aspect as well. One of the first things you're going to do is make sure that the individual involved in a case is going to have some support. So usually there will be a buddy that they work with, quite often a band 7 midwife. So some trusts, I know where I was last, we buddied people up. So if you had like a junior band 7, they would be buddied up with a senior band 7 so they could talk through what that was like. So different kind of facets of what
Sorry,
support.
does that happen in all trust? Or?
Not necessarily.
Right, okay.
Not necessarily.
Sorry,
No.
I'm a PMA, so a professional midwifery advocate. So to gain that, you do some extra training. Some people who were previously supervisors have slightly altered, done some extra training, and now we're PMAs. So from the PMA role, there was no real structure about how you provided that support. So trusts have taken on that as they feel it is required within their trust, and it's also offered in the universities. Students are offered that support. So there's kind of key elements on the PMA role, and one of them is around kind of education, supporting development of staff, helping staff to gain extra experience, grow in their roles, same with students. But another part of it is to provide restorative clinical supervision. So that supervision can be as required, or it can be set in stone. So supervision was set in stone. You had to see your supervisor every year, whereas you don't have to see a PMA. So different trusts will have taken on how they feel they need to. Different trusts may say, with any incident you're involved in, you're going to see the PMA. But that may not happen everywhere. It may be, if you feel you need to, go to them, or an offer of the PMAs are available if you'd like to talk to them.
Sounds like a great support network to have. So do you have a lot of engagement with that then?
Again, it's going to be variable in the trusts.
Okay.
And also on the people. I know that you may find within the early career midwives, there are not only the PMAs, they also often have the pastoral midwives, so midwives that are there to support new staff members. So they may not feel the need to go to a PMA because they've got a midwife whose role is to help support the junior staff during their preceptorship while they're finding their feet, really. As a brand new midwife.
Amazing. And it sounds like a great opportunity for that continued learning opportunities, doesn't it? Can I just ask, what expectation does the law place on midwives that might not always be explicit in training or culture?
It's a really good question, isn't it?
It is.
It is. I mean, obviously, we do know, the fundamentals of our role and where we kind of sit. There are a few kind of legalities around that. So in terms of, the legal need to have a midwife present at a birth, etc. But we're governed by. We obviously have the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which is where our registration is held. We have to have completed an approved course, so it depends on the length of that. We have to go through a process of revalidation, to make sure that we are fit and able
Sorry, and how often do you do that?
It's every 3 years we do the revalidation, but obviously we re-register on a yearly basis, and we are expected to update if there is any change in circumstance. So if we suddenly become too ill to function, then we should, let our regulatory body know about that as well. So there is a framework under which we operate, but what we also have as well is lots of different kind of governances, if you like. So, we can talk about NICE guidelines. So the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, everyone kind of knows those guidelines, but then you have trust guidelines as well. And you also have your job description. So in terms of your contracts that you have, in order to have a registration as a midwife, one of the rules is that you have to have indemnity insurance. So you have to have insurance to practice. And in most cases, that is through the NHS. So, you're having to kind of tick these boxes to go through. But when you've got these guidelines in a trust, they may vary from NICE. So, you're having to be really clear. So in my role, previously as a head of midwifery, one of the things was looking at our guidelines, and you would have to do a risk assessment on your own guidelines against NICE, and you would need a document to say this is why we are deviating from the NICE guidance. And I think that's really important, because when something does happen, and, we then, as an expert witness, go to NICE and go, yes, but NICE says this and you didn't do it. It's really key to look at the trust guidance to see, well, what was that individual actually being guided with in the trust? So there's like a subset of information and protocol.
But the NICE guidelines, aren't they there with a view to having a consistent standard of care across all midwifery? Because I think what we find is the differences between trusts are, it's really difficult to understand why there are so many differences.
But it might be that actually the trust goes over and above NICE, because NICE is to do the best for the largest body of individuals. Now, if you've got a particular group, I can give you an example. I used to work in a trust in East London who had the highest rate of diabetes in the country. And, their diabetes protocol went above NICE.
Yeah.
Because they knew that the incidence of gestational diabetes in certain, ethnicities was through the roof in that trust. And so they put in additional measures. So they had to risk assess them to say, we know NICE says this, but actually we need to do this because that fits our population better. And so there is a document to say why we do more. And that's what it is. Quite often it is because people do less because they don't see it so often. But that's where the role of the midwife becomes difficult, because when you have a guideline that tells you to do one thing, but NICE actually says something different, where do you sit with that?
When you talked about the national guidelines and local guidelines, because they do differ, and I'm sure Kashmir and I have seen cases where NICE guidelines says, or the RCOG guideline says something, and the trust guidelines say something else. So I've got a case where, and I can't go into the details, but it's a case where my client was diagnosed with hypoglycemia. But because of his low birth weight, the trust had their own guidelines about blood glucose monitoring and feeding. Whereas the NICE guidelines said, well, he's supposed to follow the WHO guidelines for this. There's a disparity between the two, and ultimately my client had a hypoglycemic insult leading to a brain injury. And again, there was no real explanation about the deviation, but following, pleading of negligence, it's resulting in the trust actually adopting the WHO guidance. But again, there was no explanation why there was such a deviation. And we don't always get that insight. So that's really, really helpful. Thank you.
I mean, I think it's really important to kind of understand the difference between an individual and a process. You know, because it's when you have an individual that makes a mistake, that is different to when a process or a system lets them down.
So, Kash, we often hear about gaps between policy and practice. How does that show up in the cases that you manage? So I know I've introduced you very briefly again, but if you could just tell me a little bit about your experience and also your experience in, the differences between policy and practice.
So I've actually had experience of both sides because I did a little bit of defendant work before I did claimant work. And one of the cases I dealt with as a defendant lawyer related to a undiagnosed twin pregnancy in 1980, I think it was. That shows you my age. And what happened was that the first baby was born fine. Second baby got trapped in the uterus and had a hypoxic episode and was born severely brain damaged with cerebral palsy. The midwife involved said that she followed procedure and she did everything by the book. But when we explored the evidence with her, she said that the process was baby was delivered. They believed it was a singleton pregnancy, and she gave the symptometron. And then she put her hand on the uterus and felt further fetal parts. But by that stage, the baby had been trapped. And as it came out, the guidance was you put your hand on the uterus and feel to see if there are any fetal parts there before you give the symptometron. And so as a defendant lawyer at that point, we had to then settle this claim. And it had such a profound effect on her. And my heart did go out to her because she genuinely believed that she'd done the right thing. And we kept having lots of conferences and she was involved in the conference. And I could just see the toll it was having on her. And I think she was relieved when they said, we're going to settle this claim. And I think she felt that she had to carry on sort of providing this defence to assist the trust because they were facing this claim for cerebral palsy. I've also had it as a claimant lawyer where it was a handheld pinard that was monitoring the baby's heart rate. The medical records referred to the baby having a normal heart rate. They listened before, during and after the contraction. But the baby came out and had hypoxic HIE, cerebral palsy. We couldn't work out what had happened for this to happen, for this baby to end up in this position. And as we were going through the evidence, it became clear by a process of extrapolation, really, that the midwife didn't listen for the full minute after the contraction and therefore didn't realise that there were decelerations. So that again, the process that she followed didn't correspond with the procedure, which was the policy, which was listen for a full minute. And you can understand why these things happen if you're in a busy labour ward, but the consequences of not doing that are just huge. And we as claimant lawyers I think we see a lot of it, the same thing happening time and time again. Usually the process is a CTG trace is showing decelerations, or they've picked up the baby's heart rate, or they've picked up the mother's heart rate. They've not called for an obstetric review or a fresh pair of eyes early enough. They've given syntocinon when the baby's already in distress, so they're making that even more of a stressful pregnancy. We also see other issues where there may not have been any problems or any negligence in terms of the management of the antenatal period or the delivery, but there's a very sad outcome such as stillbirths. And the mother will say, and then afterwards they took me onto the maternity ward and I was there with on a ward with all mums and all babies, and it's just that not thinking about how that would impact a mother in those circumstances. And I'm sure I don't understand why the policy would be that you take the mother who just lost a baby with stillbirth onto that maternity ward where there are mums really happy with their babies, surely that policy, you're shaking your head, that's not a policy, but we hear it so many times that that's what happened afterwards.
And that's thinking about everything else, isn't it? That's that holistic approach to the care that we provide. And we need to think about everything and how someone's experience is. You know, we've talked about the guidance and the guidelines that sometimes doesn't bring that aspect into it.
Yeah.
So that's the other bit where you say with woman and a midwife's role, that's what we need to think about, what is making this experience a better, even if it is a sad experience, a better experience for them.
Absolutely.
And I think fundamentally, you know, midwives absolutely try and you know, to facilitate the best process. I mean, as you were, you know, explaining that, I'm transported back to being the head of midwifery, and I'm sure you were thinking about being a labour ward coordinator. Most places we have bereavement suites. So I don't think I've worked in a hospital where we haven't created a space where a family can be and, you know, be supported each other with, you know, the baby that they've lost as well. So, you know, it is pretty much a usual standard now that you have a bereavement midwife and a space. But I know myself that there's one. And, you know, sometimes if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 people who unfortunately are in that situation where, you know, we're in an overcrowded service, you know, especially, I mean, I'm looking at, you know, a lot of the trusts that I kind of go into, their footprint does not in any way cover the amount of activity that they have, you know, and what you tend to find is as trusts get bigger and government targets change, you know, different departments get made bigger, and it always seems to squeeze on. It's normally the gynecology service that gets smaller, or the maternity service, you know, and that's really difficult. And so, you know, the staff are trying to make the best of a space that they're being squeezed into a smaller and smaller. I mean, it's the same in community. When I first started in community, you know, if you said to a GP, we're going to take the midwife away because you've only had one pregnant woman this year, they'd be knocking on the door of the chief exec going, you're not taking my midwife. You know, now you would get like notices from GP surgeries going, sorry, you're going to need to leave that surgery because we've got somebody else who's paying us more to use that room than you are. And, you know, we're supposed to be taking services out to women and being where they are. And actually what we're finding is we're having to claw it all back because we don't have, you know, the appropriate space for them.
It's really sad, isn't it? We spoke at length about this particular issue with the director of the Maternity and Neonatal Service Investigation, or MNSI for short. So the last episode, I was in conversation with Sandy Lewis and Karen Armsden, the maternity investigator from MNSI. And we were talking about how, you know, those in senior leadership roles, they need to do better in terms of implementing better services, better policies, not only for mums and babies, but also looking after their staff. We also talked about, you know, the usual themes, including the NHS funding. But one of the key talking points that came out of that discussion was the fact that we need to be able to empower those clinicians on the ground floor. And I wondered what your views were about that.
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, first thing you need to do is look at and define what you mean by senior leadership. You know, I mean, as I say, I was a head of midwifery. When I first started in that role, you know, we created the local maternity system. I had to spend time setting up the maternity system whilst managing 2 services. We then obviously had the first Ockenden report, who said that every trust needs a director of midwifery. And then essentially part of the role that I'd already been doing went to this person to be able to assure the board, etc. So,
has that been implemented in every trust, a director of midwifery?
It did, because of the Ockenden. So it was then, and there was.
But she
funding.
made lots of recommendations, didn't she, in her Ockenden report, and so few of them have been implemented.
Well, I mean, there was money that came down from NHSE to enable that. So we looked at the staffing numbers. We looked at the labour ward coordinator being the supernumerary all the time. Quite a few things, and I think the director of midwifery was a really positive change in that it freed up the head of midwifery to be the operational person. We're not having to spend meeting after meeting after meeting at the board providing assurance. The director could do that whilst the head of midwifery looked after the staff on the ground floor and the matrons, etc. So in some ways it was really positive. But the other thing that happened was, the amount of assurance and reassurance we had to provide trebled. And so, there was all this additional paperwork. I mean, I went from, going round the unit, of a morning and seeing how everyone was, to having to fill out a staffing ratio every 4 hours and having to be on calls, Teams calls with staff every 4 hours, but that's great because it gives me an understanding of what's happening on the shop floor. But it means for someone like Kathryn, she's got to walk away from the labour ward where she's supposed to know what's going on in every room and come and talk to me on a Teams thing to tell me, well, she hasn't got enough staff.
Yeah.
And what I really need her doing is being in that room, and I should be going to her. It has created a real dichotomy of it's supposed to help, but it also creates its own
hinders as well.
Its own issue.
Yeah. And that brings me nicely to the recent appointment of Michelle Welsh, the MP, who's been appointed as the National Maternity Advisor. And ultimately, as I understand, her role is to work directly with families, with the NHS and the MPs. Now, is this a positive step? I mean, is this likely to bring about positive changes, or, and this is my view, are we simply just adding another layer where recommendations are made, people are being appointed, but the actual doing isn't being done?
Personally, and I'm sure Kathryn will also, kind of give us her view. But for me, I think it is a positive thing. I think it is an addition. I think anybody who comes in and champions maternity and opens those conversations is doing a positive thing. What you're not doing is taking someone off the shop floor to go and do that. As long as she has that conversation with the families, etc., and the staff, to go and see what it's like on that ground floor, what it feels like to be that member of staff. And, from my own experience, I've had to walk out to the car park and, go and knock on a car window because I've had a midwife sobbing in her car because she can't bring herself to come into the labour ward because she's so distressed over a shift she had previously and things that had happened and things that had been said that she physically was shaking so much she couldn't get out of her car.
It's a real shame.
Yeah. And, and that can be the reality. You also have to remember that these staff have all been through 2 lots of COVID, and that created this massive ripple effect in terms of maternity services.
Maternity changed quite significantly.
Absolutely, and so we've got a lot of staff who were really traumatised by that. So for me, anybody in those senior positions, as long as they go to the shop floor, they listen to it and they bring both sides together to kind of, it is a positive thing. And it's in addition, it's not, taking someone who has been really important, in the NHS and pulling them away from what they're doing. in order to provide that job, because that's what we've seen too much of. We've seen too much of, let's create this additional thing by taking, with the best will in the world, HSIB as it was, obviously it is a completely kind of independent MSNI as it is now. They provide independent investigations. The majority of their staff are midwives. Their midwives came from the shop floor because they paid them more than the NHS could pay them.
And that's really key point, really, because we often talk about the common themes that we see as lawyers in maternity care. And often it comes down to several things, one of which is the shortages of staff. And that, you talked about Donna Ockendon's review, and we know with the Nottingham hospitals, Donna Ockendon's leading, I think one of the biggest maternity reviews, and her report is going to be published on the 24th of June. So I assume that some of the recommendations or the themes that will come out of that are something that is not new to all of us sat on this particular sofa. But what I want to really get to the heart of is, how do we empower, or what do we need to do to not only recruit more staff, but train them, retain them? How do we do that? And how do we bring about that culture that allows for that?
So from being in the university, maternity, midwifery is one of the better uptake from, comparative to your nursing, your children's nursing. People want to be midwives. People think of midwifery as a wonderful job. The course is hard. They took away the bursaries. They made it a degree and not necessarily a working like a diploma or working to become a midwife. So it has become harder to get onto the course, which comes with its pros and cons, doesn't it? But you're potentially losing some of the people who would come up and build up and develop through that role. Then I'm sure you've seen that there's been conversations about more jobs for the early career midwives and the numbers of jobs that are available. So through training these midwives, we need to support them with attaining jobs at the end of it, because that in itself will improve their experience and their feelings.
Is there an issue about getting a job at the end of your training?
Over the last few years, there have been difficulties for midwives for getting jobs, and it has gone to Parliament in regards to talking about how many jobs can be provided to early career midwives.
And I think that's a really key point. Actually, we're training these staff, and then there's no jobs at the end of them because the trusts are not having the right numbers of staff on the ground floor where they need them. It's very much, if you consider maternity service as, a pregnant A&E, essentially, we can't, unless you're having a caesarean section or, even an induction of labour, we don't know quite when it's going to happen. So sometimes we will have staff who are just around because there's not that person there right at that one moment. But you need to have them there in case that person does come through the door, because you're always fighting with, okay, so now we're short-staffed because two women have come in labour and now we've only got one midwife. So midwives are constantly looking after more women at one time than they should. If you look at things like induction of labour, it's nearly always on the postnatal or the antenatal ward where there's only one or two midwives for all those women, and you're expecting a pre-prostin CTG and and escalation if things go wrong, etc. There probably isn't a doctor attached to that ward, but the trust just doesn't have the right number of midwives. And I will give you an example of this. Sorry, it's a bit of here comes my passion, Harvey. When I was looking at my staffing, I had a certain percentage of time I had for sickness and training. and I had 4 days for a whole-time equivalent member of staff. So for every midwife I had 4 days
So you
training.
allowed them 4 days on the basis that,
I was allowed 4 days training, okay? Now, I had an 85% part-time workforce. So, only 15% of my workforce were full-time. So if you consider, if you have 2 midwives who are doing part-time, they both need 4 days training. They don't get 2 each.
Yeah.
So as soon as you have that part-time workforce, you're then out of pocket. And what they say to you is, no, you can't employ anymore because you're already right up to your number.
But it's a false economy, isn't it? Because this is where the problem. I mean, so I dealt with cases from Telford and Shrewsbury, and the emphasis there on the vaginal deliveries. So one of my clients, her baby was a breech, but it wasn't a footling breech; it was a buttocks breech, and she said to them, "I want to have a cesarean section." She could not have been clearer about it, but they just encourage her. And that baby was delivered, but he got trapped at his abdomen. And then, for some reason, they tried to push him back into the uterus. And obviously, he suffered catastrophic brain injury, and I think he survived for about 40 minutes and then died. And the issue there was this emphasis on vaginal deliveries, whereas if they'd taken into account her wishes for a cesarean section, although it's going to cost more, ultimately it's going to cost less than a claim that then arose because she had a severe psychiatric injury as a result of this. So I just don't understand how, government thinking, Department of Health and this new MP, I hope that she goes onto the shop floor and she sees what you're doing and she realises that imposing conditions and standards and goals at the Department of Health actually are detrimental to the work that you're doing and the outcome for a lot of these mothers, because you shouldn't be complying with guidelines in terms of numbers of vaginal deliveries, numbers of cesarean sections. You need to be dealing with the mother as you find the mother and making your decisions accordingly.
I have to say, I think one of the kind of outcomes really of quite a lot of the reviews is a generalised understanding in maternity that actually your cesarean section rate is not a determination of quality anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really positive thing. I think there is a lot less of, physiological birth at any cost. We're not seeing that as much. What we are seeing is trusts who have a 50% caesarean section rate. And as I've previously discussed with things, there are implications. When you have multiple caesarean sections, there are physical implications to the mother and the baby.
Yeah.
And so in terms of kind of informed consent, it's around, making sure that you understand that it's not just an operation, and that's it, and everything will be fine. There are other things down the line that you need to kind of think about and consider as well. So, yes, we don't consider it anymore as a, we're doing really well.
Yes,
we're at 20%, caesarean section, and that means we're really good. That's gone.
Yes. I find that such a strange target, because how could the number of caesarean sections, because that is not determined by the quality of the midwifery care that you provide. That's determined by the presentation of the woman. I've had 3 caesarean sections, and, that is just the nature of me, and I couldn't deliver. So I find that as a target just really hard to understand.
I think it's really important how that culture has changed, and obviously it's taken time, but actually it's positive because it means that those heavily enriched cultures that have been prevalent in the NHS, particularly in maternity services, they are capable of change. And I think that's a real positive, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think, if we can get that kind of voice out there, I think there needs to be an understanding that midwives are not physiological birth at any cost. What they want is a happy, healthy family at the end of it. That is their fundamental wish with all of this. And if things unfortunately do go wrong, they're desperate to learn and for it to not happen again. But where they become failed is systems and processes, and it's around that. I mean, when we talk about training new staff, I used to get told, right, you're going to double the number of students you have next year. Well, who's going to look after that student? What sort of experience is that going to be for that student when you've basically got one midwife looking after two of them? And these are now individuals who are having to pay for their training. How do we go through and look after them effectively, and then if we have to fail them because they're not good enough, because they've paid all this for their course, and that really also brought up its own issue.
That's really unfair on them, isn't it? Because if they've paid and they've not had the level of training
absolutely.
that they...
Absolutely.
It's almost like being shortchanged, isn't it?
Totally.
So it sounds like in terms of recruitment, training and retention, it's all multifactorial. There's no real one explanation for it. And I do think that maternity training is the key. And I echo everything that you've said. I think it's something that we are certainly very passionate about, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yeah. So on that note, Fletchers and we're really proud and really pleased that they've done this. They've launched this maternity funding grant. So it's to help with training of midwives. And we launched it in March, and we've had 12 grants that we've made. Because at the end of the day, the work that we do, we want it to make a difference. So we want, like everybody does, every birth, every baby, every family, to have a really positive outcome. So we're really proud of our maternity funding grant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share that with you, but it's a brilliant opportunity. And we always talk about how we want to be, forward leaders, if you like, in improving and championing better maternity care. And part of that work is supporting the midwives on the ground floor and doing whatever we can within our means to support midwives, and not only to, get them into midwifery, but also retain them. Because I think there was recent statistics out there about there's over 4,000 shortages of midwives at present, which to me is mind-boggling, because we talk about wanting to improve care. We've got, the MPs being appointed, etc. But it all comes down to actually getting people through the door and on the shop floor. So, we really want to be part of that conversation. And we really want to assist where we can to actually get more people through the door and actually stay in maternity care, because there's so much good work being done. And we want to see more of that.
So on that point, both of you have stayed in maternity care for 20 years, 30 years. What's kept you there?
I think it's a wonderful job. I think it's a privilege to be present when a family happens, and, they may not remember us in particular. And, there's lots of families that I remember. And, you just feel that you're lucky to be there. And I feel lucky that I've not lost the passion for midwifery. And I think that's what keeps you going, is that you do want to see improvements. You do want to help the families, but also you want to see the other midwives and the junior midwives start to feel confident, and that in itself is also really lovely to see as well.
Absolutely,
Yeah, I think it's, I can remember back to, some of my amazing shifts that I had, as a community midwife, and the fun. I mean, I'm still friends with people whose babies I birthed. Friends of mine have moved to New Zealand, and their eldest has just got engaged, and he's, finished university and got a job, and and yeah, he was a home birth of mine. So it is that kind of sense of longevity, if you like, and I think for I mean, I'm speaking personally myself now. I feel for the new midwives, if you like, of today, that they're not going to have quite that level of rapport, and and that for me is my passion, is voicing for them what it can be like, and what what the potential is there if it's done properly.
Can I just talk about the impact on families? Because we've talked a lot about midwives, the impact on them and the governance side of things. The impact on families, and we often see this, don't we, in our day-to-day job, which is, families come to us to tell us, well, we don't really know what's happened. All we want to do is understand where things have gone wrong. Is it my fault? Should I have said something? Should I have done something more? And often they tell us that having a full and clear debrief helps them, because ultimately, we advocate for families who are going through almost like a grief process.
Yes, it is.
And having a full debrief allows that process to start. So from your point of view, how important is it to provide that full debrief to families?
It's really important, but the timing needs to be right for when it's done. Is the kind of the important aspect, and the right person. I know trusts do have like birth afterthoughts or birth in mind. Sometimes it is the PMAs that take on that role. Sometimes it might be the consultant obstetrician that takes on that role. It depends on what.
Or the consultant midwife.
Or the consultant midwife. It depends on what has occurred and what led to the family needing to have that debrief. But it needs to be done well. And I think those that are doing it hopefully will have had more training in how to support the families with that, and also knowing where to signpost afterwards, because it's not just a conversation and a read through your notes about this happened and this happened. We now need to go further with what can we offer you next, and what psychological support do you need, or is there anything else? So I think it's about having a much broader experience than just let's debrief and talk through what happened.
And a lot of our clients, when we ask them what do you want to achieve, and sometimes they say, just it doesn't happen to anybody else. That's the learning aspect for them is really, really important.
And I think getting that feedback that actually, we have embedded this into our training now would be really supportive to those families. And I would like to hope that the governance teams are providing that feedback and that communication with the families. And I know the families are kept involved for a long time, aren't they?
Yeah.
It is really difficult, actually, because, when things have happened, I mean, a governance team is very much supposed to advocate for the family, but it's really difficult when, the governance team is part of the trust. And it's, where that kind of, where does that impartiality completely lie? Because, I know my governance team absolutely, went down the line and were completely impartial and wanted what was best for that family. But it's the perception of that, isn't it? And but it could become an external feature. But I've also seen cases where, someone has had a really tragic incident in one pregnancy and have been promised lots of things for the next subsequent pregnancy, and then are having to kind of ring round going, but you said that I could do this, or you said this would happen, and that continuity isn't there. So something needs to happen to kind of bridge that gap. I mean, when I was a consultant midwife, I used to do the birth debriefs, and at the last trust I managed, I had a birth debrief service, but the waiting list was 6 months. And as Kathryn said, it needs to be at the right time, but it needs to be at the right time for the family, not the trust. So it's really hard.
Yeah. And the thing is, families never forget what they're being told. So, for example, midwives might come across many ladies on a day-to-day basis, and they may provide, many debriefs with various families. But for one particular family, it's their only opportunity to sit down, and they always remember and recall conversations they never forget. So as much, the debrief itself and the timings and who provides that debrief is important. But also, I think things like choice of words are also really important, because it ultimately stays with families for many, many years. And in some instances, I've had people say, well, actually, somebody who was sat there across from me said this, and it's re-traumatized them because, and it might have just been said as a by the way comment or very innocently, but as I say, families never forget.
Yeah, and that's having the training in trauma-informed care, and that's what's really important. And I do feel like, over the last 5 years, that is something that is becoming a lot more embedded into training and in universities, but also within trusts. And I know I've definitely had external people come in for training to kind of help the staff, not just as in like an MDT training, so obstetricians, anaesthetists and midwives, to help us improve the experience, not just the clinical aspect. So like that, we see a lot about how people feel they've been talked to and the language is used. So to kind of, the human factors part of it. So to kind of make us think more about what we're saying, and then the civility between staff as well.
So we've talked a lot about where things can sometimes go wrong and also where things can go right. Importantly, we've talked about midwives on the shop floor in governance role, but also we've talked about families and the importance of them being involved in that process and the opportunity to give them a proper debrief at the right time. What I want to ask is what can be done outside of the legal process. So my view, and it is only my view, is that I think there is a lack of joined-up thinking within the NHS. So there are many NHS trusts and many maternity services. I would love for us to come to a day where there is a bit more of a joined-up thinking and a joined-up approach. Can I come to you first, Kash, and invite your comments about that?
Yeah, so I was very privileged to attend a birth injury roundtable meeting in March, where we had representatives from the NHSR, we had a lady from the MNSI, representatives from charities, representatives from defendant solicitors, a midwife, an obstetrician, and we all talked about the themes, and the themes were, a lot of it was about communication. And I felt that in the room there was a lot of frustration that we all want the same thing, but there just seems to be some obstacles to get us there. And I think it's the collective thinking point, isn't it? That there are these obstacles, but there seems to be a real difficulty in how do we overcome those obstacles to get us to the place that we all want to be. But as I say, it was really comforting to know that everybody is aiming for the same thing, but the mechanics of how we get there is the problem, and the logistics of how we get there. And maybe you just need somebody, one individual, who has the ability to look at the whole of the maternity services across the country and say, right, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to apply universally across all trusts so that the same really good quality of care is provided to mothers, babies and their families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Kashmir said, we're very fortunate that Fletchers were able to facilitate that conversation. We have also published a report outlining some of the common themes that we discussed, and also some of the things. I like to think that we came away feeling positive that changes can be made. The reality whether they can be made with the right investment and all the other things that we talked about is probably one we need to wait and see. But we do have a very detailed report published that talks into more detail about that. So if anybody does want to have a read, then by all means just click on the link and it'll take you straight to the report.
At the end of the day, what we all want is really good maternity care, and so our round table and the paper is with a view to achieving that.
Absolutely. And that brings me on to asking you both, what gives you hope for the future for maternity care?
I'll go first. I think things like this. I think, having those conversations. I think, people need to be brave. They need to, be open and honest, and kind of really look outside the box at what can change. That there isn't huge amounts of money. Someone isn't going to drop, suddenly, 4,000 midwives in and everything's going to be lovely.
But it's not just about the money and number of midwives.
Exactly. It's about the conversations, and it's about, I think for me, it's, families understanding that no midwife goes to work and wants a bad outcome. Midwives are just as devastated, if not more, when things happen. And I think for me that the kind of the passion and the hope is that we can support new midwives as they come through, so that they can continue with that passion and engagement and they're getting the support, so they don't become jaded and disillusioned and disappear. It's really about kind of keeping it all going.
I think for me, I see a good retention rate of midwives where I work, and I think that having those connections and those supports around the midwives, and you see them grow and you see them becoming the next person to support the junior staff, and how, yes, it's a very female-based workforce, but we mother each other as well, and we look after each other, and we not only, supporting the families, but working on a labour ward, you become a family together. You are each other's support network, and some of my best friends are the people that I work with and that I've trained with. And I think that gives me hope that I see that still happening, and I see that people still have that kind of feeling of coming to work and making friends and having that support around them there. I think from a midwifery aspect for the women, it's that we hear their voices more now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that voice wasn't really in there. And now the reports that are coming through are wanting to hear their experience. And that's what we learn from. We learn from what they're experiencing. Not the statistics are there, they're important, but we need to know how they felt about what happened to them as well. And that's where the change, hopefully, will start to develop at that point.
Absolutely. And it's so important what you've just said, which is about, families and mothers and parents, they want to be listened to. So how often do we hear about mums and dads saying, well, actually, I wasn't listened to, I wasn't heard. But it's now that we're seeing more recognition and acknowledgement of that, it's brilliant, because I do genuinely think that it will pave the way to hopefully going a long way towards improving maternity care here in the UK. My final questions for each of my guests today is this. What is the one key thing you hope that people listening to this take away from our conversation today? And I'll start. The one thing that I will be taking away from this conversation is that midwives genuinely do want to provide care, but it's also really, really important that there is more investment and more work to be done in terms of recruitment, training, and retention. And those are the things that and I'm sure I speak for everybody at Fletchers Solicitors, that is something that we advocate strongly for, and we genuinely want to champion better maternity care. So I'll come to you, Kash.
I think it's largely on the same lines, and it's really really good to hear that you've got a retention in your unit. And I always think of one born every minute, the family of the midwives and how they all support each other. And it's really good to hear that things are changing and clients feel listened to, because that was one of the issues that they'd said, nobody listened to me. So, and I know half of it is outside pressures, but everything that you're doing internally within your units is really, really wonderful to hear. And, I know we've got these massive inquiries at the moment and it all sounds such doom and gloom, but, these are historical things. So moving forward, I hope that maternity care just continues to improve and we have the good outcomes that we all want.
Yeah.
Amanda?
I think, I think from today, taking away is that, everybody has a different voice, and it's really good to hear everyone's different voice, and different people bring different things, which is the value in having, multi-professionals sitting around a table, as you've quite rightly said. And I think that's where you get these really rich conversations. And I think that needs to happen more. And I think, staff need to be able to have that time together themselves. They need to be sat down with their consultant colleagues and their junior doctors and, their junior midwives and the support workers together. They need to sit down together and talk through things, and that's where the communication will really improve. That team working will really get there, and I think there is a future. I think every day there are, babies and people who birth are having the most amazing experience with the most amazing midwives. I've been privileged to work with some of the best people in the country, and it's just amazing what they do every day. And I think, I'm just really proud to have been part of that, I think. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to take away.
That's lovely. And finally,
I feel that to take away from today is that I hope people see that we care. We midwives do care. We want the best for people. We feel deeply when something doesn't go well, and we want to learn and we want things to improve for families.
amazing. Well, thank you very much to each and every one of my guests, to Kashmir, to Amanda and to Kathryn. Thank you very much for taking part in what I think is a really important conversation to have. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners and viewers. Join us next time, where I will be in discussion with two leading obstetric and fetal maternal experts, as well as a leading birth injury specialist lawyer. If you haven't done so already, do go back and listen and or watch back on our earlier episode. This podcast is brought to you by Fletchers Solicitors as part of our campaign for every birth, for every baby, for every family, championing better maternity care through every family's story. I look forward to seeing you all on the next episode.